Story 1. The hollow that wasn't on any map. Marcus Pemberton had been delivering propane to remote Appalachian communities for 17 years, and he thought he knew every forgotten hollow and unmarked dirt road in eastern Kentucky. His route covered a 100-mile radius of coal country where families still lived without running water and heated their homes with wood stoves. It was October 2019 when he took a delivery request that would fundamentally alter his understanding of the mountains he'd driven his entire adult life. The order came through on a Tuesday afternoon. A woman named Sarah Corrigan had called the office requesting an emergency propane delivery to an address on Blackbird Hollow Road. Marcus checked his maps, both paper and digital. No Blackbird Hollow Road existed in his coverage area. He called the customer back, and an elderly woman answered, her voice crackling with age and what sounded like genuine desperation. She explained that her husband was dying, that they needed heat, and that their tanks had run dry during an early cold snap. She provided detailed directions. Take Route 119 south past the old Blackwood mine, turn left at the 4th unmarked dirt road past mile marker 47, follow it 6 miles into the mountains. Marcus wasn't the kind of man who left elderly people to freeze. He loaded 200 gallons of propane onto his truck and headed out at 3 in the afternoon, giving himself plenty of daylight. The sky was overcast, threatening rain, and the temperature was dropping fast. He found the turnoff exactly where she'd described it, a narrow dirt road barely wide enough for his truck, branches scraping both sides as he climbed deeper into the mountains. The road twisted and switchbacked, climbing steadily. His odometer showed he'd gone 8 miles when he should have gone 6. But mountain roads always felt longer than they measured. The hollow opened suddenly before him, a small valley carved between 2 ridges, and it was wrong in ways Marcus couldn't immediately articulate. The trees were too uniform, all the same height and species, eastern hemlocks that grew in unnaturally straight rows. The light was different here, dimmer despite the overcast sky, as if the air itself absorbed illumination. 4 houses stood in the hollow, all identical clapboard structures painted the same faded yellow, positioned at perfect 90-degree angles to each other around a central clearing. No vehicles, no power lines, no satellite dishes. Nothing that suggested anyone had lived here in decades, yet smoke rose from one chimney. Marcus parked near the smoking house and climbed down from his cab. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, no insects. Just an oppressive quiet that made his ears ring. He approached the house and knocked. The door opened immediately, as if someone had been standing right behind it, waiting. The woman who answered matched the voice on the phone, ancient and thin, with eyes so pale they were almost white. She smiled, revealing too many teeth, more than a human mouth should contain. "You found us," she said. "Not many can anymore." Marcus tried to respond, but his voice caught. Something about her wrongness paralyzed his vocal cords. She gestured toward the propane tank on the side of the house, and he moved mechanically, grateful for a task that didn't require speaking. As he worked, connecting the hoses and opening valves, he noticed details that made his hands shake. The house had no foundation, sitting directly on the earth. The windows were painted black from the inside. The wood siding was warm to the touch, almost feverish despite the cold air. Movement in his peripheral vision made him turn. People emerged from the other 3 houses. Men, women, children, all dressed in clothing from different eras. A man in a Union Army uniform. A woman in a dress from the 1920s, a child in overalls that could have been from any decade. They stood perfectly still, watching him with those same pale, empty eyes. Marcus counted them. 13 people. They began walking toward him in perfect synchronization, their feet hitting the ground at exactly the same instant. He finished the connection faster than he'd ever worked before, hands fumbling with equipment he'd operated thousands of times. The old woman appeared beside him, impossibly close, though he hadn't heard her approach. She pressed something into his palm, a $50 bill, but it was wrong. The date read 1876, and the paper felt like fabric, like human skin. "Come back," she whispered. "We need so many things. Come back and bring others." Marcus ran to his truck, not caring about professionalism or procedure. He started the engine, threw it into reverse, and backed down the narrow road at dangerous speed. The 13 figures stood motionless in the clearing, watching him flee. He drove backwards for what felt like miles until the road finally widened enough to turn around. When he glanced in his mirror, the hollow had vanished. Where the valley had been, there was only an unbroken wall of hemlocks, as if the land had closed behind him like a wound healing. He reached Route 119 as darkness fell, his heart still hammering. The next morning, he reported to work early and checked the dispatch logs. No record of Sarah Corrigan's call existed. His supervisor confirmed they'd received no requests for Blackbird Hollow Road, a place that didn't appear in any database. Marcus insisted on checking his truck's GPS history. The device showed he'd driven Route 119 straight through yesterday afternoon without stopping, without turning, covering his entire shift in a smooth, unbroken line. But the $50 bill remained in his pocket, the ancient paper warm against his thigh. He tried to throw it away 17 times. Each time it reappeared in his possession. In his wallet, in his glove compartment, under his pillow. He tried burning it, but it wouldn't catch fire. He tried burying it, but found it in his coffee cup the next morning. 3 weeks later, Marcus received another call at home. The same elderly voice, the same desperate plea. This time asking for groceries, for medicine, for company. He blocked the number, but she called from different numbers, always the same voice, always the same invitation to return. The calls came at exactly 3:47 every afternoon, the precise moment he'd first turned onto that unmarked road. Marcus quit his job and moved to Lexington, seeking the anonymity of a city. But sometimes, driving through town, he'll spot an unmarked dirt road that seems to lead nowhere. His truck will slow of its own accord, his hands turning the wheel without his permission, and he'll find himself driving up into mountains that shouldn't exist in this part of Kentucky. The road always looks familiar. The hemlocks always grow in perfect rows. And somewhere ahead, he knows, 13 figures wait in their timeless clearing, ready to welcome him home to a hollow that exists in no atlas, on no map, in no version of reality where propane tanks need filling and $50 bills from 1876 can buy passage to places that hunger for visitors foolish enough to deliver what they request. The bill stays in his wallet now. He stopped trying to lose it. Some nights in his apartment, he traces the faded engraving with his finger and wonders what they truly want from him, what they wanted all along, and why, despite everything, a part of him aches to find that unmarked road again, to drive those impossible miles, to stand once more in that silent clearing where 13 figures wait with patient, ancient hunger for the deliveryman who found what should have stayed lost in the mountains that remember everything and forgive nothing. Story 2. The Thing in the Coal Seam. James Rutherford had worked underground for 32 years, ever since his 18th birthday when he followed his father into the mines of southern West Virginia. He'd survived 2 cave-ins, 1 flood, and countless equipment failures. He knew the darkness beneath the mountains better than he knew his own neighborhood. The Blackwater mine, where he'd spent the last decade as a shift supervisor, extended 4 miles into the mountain following a thick seam of bituminous coal that had formed 300 million years ago when West Virginia was a coastal swamp. James had walked every tunnel, inspected every support beam, and mapped every chamber. He thought he knew every inch of that mine until November 2017, when his crew broke through into a space that shouldn't have existed. They were extending Tunnel 7, the farthest reach of the mine, when Tommy Chen's drill punched through into emptiness. The bit spun free, and the sudden lack of resistance nearly threw Tommy off balance. James called for a halt and approached the hole. He shined his helmet lamp through the opening. The beam disappeared into blackness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He couldn't see the far wall, couldn't see the ceiling, couldn't see anything. The hole exhaled cold air that smelled wrong. Not the usual mineral smell of underground spaces, but something organic and rotten, like meat that had been sealed away for decades. Protocol demanded they report the discovery and wait for engineers to assess the cavity before proceeding. But James had been mining long enough to know that engineers meant delays, and delays meant the company might decide the extension wasn't worth the cost. His crew needed this tunnel operational to justify their jobs. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his considerably shortened life. He ordered the crew to widen the hole. Within an hour, they'd opened a passage large enough to enter. James, Tommy, and Rick Sawyer, their equipment operator, crawled through into the cavity beyond. Their helmet lamps revealed a chamber that violated everything James understood about geology. The space was perfectly spherical, approximately 60 feet in diameter, with walls that weren't rock but something else entirely. The surface was smooth, almost glassy, with a texture that seemed to shift when viewed directly but held still in peripheral vision. The floor curved downward like being inside a giant ball, and their boots made no sound on the strange surface, as if it absorbed even vibration. In the center of the chamber sat an object. James's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. It resembled a massive cocoon roughly 12 feet long and 6 feet wide, made of a substance that glistened wetly in their lights. Veins or tubes ran through it, pulsing with movement, suggesting something inside remained alive. The thing radiated cold so intense that their breath froze in the air, and frost formed on their gloves when they approached. Tommy reached the cocoon first. He extended one hand toward it, curiosity overriding caution, and touched the surface. The reaction was immediate. The cocoon convulsed, the pulsing intensifying, and Tommy screamed. His hand adhered to the surface and stuck fast, and he couldn't pull free. James and Rick grabbed him, pulling, but Tommy's screams reached a pitch that no human voice should achieve. The flesh of his hand was disappearing, not being eaten but absorbed, drawn into the cocoon like water into a sponge. They pulled harder, and Tommy's screaming stopped abruptly as his eyes rolled back and his body went rigid. Rick ran for the exit, crawling back through the passage, yelling for help. James held Tommy, watching in horror as the absorption accelerated, spreading up his arm, his shoulder, his neck. Tommy's body was collapsing inward, being pulled into the cocoon, but there was no blood, no tearing of flesh, just a smooth disappearance as if he'd never been solid at all. James finally released him and stumbled, backward, falling on the curved floor. Tommy's entire body was drawn into the cocoon in the span of 30 seconds, leaving nothing behind, not even his clothes or his mining helmet. The thing pulsed brighter, the veins glowing with a pale luminescence, and James swore he could see movement inside. Shadows of something that might have been limbs or might have been something with no earthly name. James crawled back through the passage, emerging into Tunnel 7 where Rick had gathered the rest of the crew. He ordered an immediate evacuation, telling them there'd been a structural collapse, that Tommy had been crushed, that they needed to seal this section. The crew didn't question him. They'd heard the screaming. They'd seen his face. They left their equipment and fled toward the surface. James reported the incident as he'd described it to the crew. A collapse. Tommy's body irrecoverable. The company accepted the explanation with the grim inevitability of an industry where such tragedies occurred with statistical regularity. They sealed Tunnel 7 with a concrete plug, marking it as unsafe and closed permanently. James said nothing about the chamber, about the cocoon, about what had taken Tommy. He convinced himself it was shock, hallucination, the stress of watching a man die. He tried to forget. But 3 weeks later, James returned to work and noticed something wrong. The sealed entrance to Tunnel 7 showed signs of disturbance. The concrete plug had a crack running through it, and the crack wept moisture that glowed faintly in the darkness. He reported it to maintenance, and they resealed the tunnel with a double-thick plug. James watched them work, and he could have sworn he heard something from beyond the concrete. A sound like breathing, or like something enormous moving through confined spaces, drawing closer. The next morning, Rick Sawyer didn't report for his shift. His wife called the mine office saying he'd left for work before dawn but never arrived. Search parties found his truck in the parking lot, driver's door open, his lunch pail on the seat. No sign of Rick. Security footage showed him walking toward the mine entrance at 5:30 a.m. Then the camera glitched, filling with static. And when the image cleared, Rick had vanished. James knew, though he couldn't explain how. He entered the mine alone, violating every safety protocol, carrying only a helmet lamp and a crowbar. He reached Tunnel 7 and found the concrete plug had cracked again, this time wide enough for a man to squeeze through. The crack exhaled that same rotten cold air. James forced himself through the gap, knowing what he'd find, unable to stop himself from confirming his nightmare. The chamber had grown. It was now 80 feet across, the walls extending outward like a bubble inflating. The cocoon remained at the center, but it had changed. It was larger, bloated, and Tommy's face pressed against the translucent surface from inside, mouth open in a silent scream, eyes searching blindly. Beside him, Rick's face emerged, equally frozen in terror. But they weren't dead. Their eyes moved. Their mouths worked soundlessly. They were aware, trapped, alive in whatever hell that thing represented. James ran. He emerged from Tunnel 7, sealed the crack himself with emergency foam sealant, and quit his job that afternoon. He reported nothing. How could he? Who would believe that beneath the mountains, in a space that geology couldn't explain, something ancient waited in the coal seams, collecting miners the way children collect insects in jars? Something that had been buried when the swamps turned to stone, sealed in the earth for millions of years until men with drills and greed broke through and offered it access to fresh sustenance. The mine closed permanently 6 months later. Not from James's warnings, but from economic pressure. The company sealed all entrances with concrete and steel. James moved to Charleston, taking a job as a warehouse supervisor, never going underground again. But he monitors the news from Blackwater obsessively. Twice a year, someone goes missing near the old mine site. Hikers, teenagers exploring forbidden territory, homeless people seeking shelter, they're never found. And James knows with the certainty of a man who's seen hell breathing in the darkness that the chamber is still growing, that the cocoon still pulses, and that somewhere in the darkness beneath West Virginia, faces press against a translucent membrane, screaming silently, adding their voices to a collection that began long before humans walked upright, and will continue long after the mountains themselves have eroded to dust. Story 3. The station that broadcasts backwards. Linda Hutchins moved to eastern Tennessee in August 2018 to work as a park ranger at Cherokee National Forest. She'd spent 10 years with the National Park Service in Wyoming, but family obligations brought her back to the Appalachians where she'd grown up. The isolation suited her. Her cabin sat 20 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding mountain road that tested her Jeep's suspension and her nerve every time she drove it. Cell service was non-existent, but the cabin had satellite internet and a landline. For entertainment, she had books, streaming services when the internet cooperated, and an old AM/FM radio her predecessor had left behind. She discovered the station during her second week while scanning through channels late one night. Most stations came in weakly, heavy with static, but one signal arrived crystal clear. No station identification, no call letters, just music from the 1940s and 50s. Big band jazz, crooners. Music her grandmother would have recognized. Linda appreciated the nostalgic quality and left it on while she cooked dinner. The first hint of wrongness came when the music stopped mid-song and a voice began speaking. Woman's voice, smooth and professional, the cadence of a mid-century radio announcer. But she was reading the news backwards. Not gibberish, not reversed audio, but perfect English delivered in reverse chronological order. She described events from later in the day, then earlier, working backward through the hours. Linda stopped chopping vegetables and listened, certain she was misunderstanding. At 6:42 this evening, a red Jeep Wrangler will park outside a cabin on Forest Service Road 17. The driver, a woman with dark hair, will exit the vehicle carrying 2 bags of groceries. She will drop a can of tomatoes, and it will roll under the vehicle. At 6:37, the same vehicle will depart the Pigeon Forge grocery store. At 6:15, the woman will select those groceries, debating between 2 brands of pasta sauce before choosing the cheaper option. Linda's skin went cold. She'd done all those things. The can of tomatoes still sat under her Jeep. She'd chosen the cheaper sauce. The broadcast continued, working backward through her day. Her lunch break at Klingman's Dome, her morning patrol, her shower, her dreams. Events from her private life that no one could know, delivered in calm, backward progression until the voice reached the previous evening and stopped. The music resumed. Linda stood in her kitchen, knife forgotten, trying to rationalize what she'd heard. Coincidence. Lucky guesses. Except the details were too specific, too accurate. She turned off the radio and tried to forget about it, convincing herself she'd misheard or misunderstood. But the next night, curiosity overwhelmed caution. She turned on the radio and found the station immediately, as if it were waiting for her. The same music. Then at exactly 9 p.m., the voice returned. This time it was a man, same professional cadence, describing tomorrow's events in reverse. A meeting with her supervisor at 2 p.m. A fallen tree blocking the western trail she'd need to clear. A phone call from her sister at noon. Rain starting at 10:15 a.m. All delivered backwards, from evening to morning. Linda wrote down the predictions. The next day, every single one occurred exactly as described. The rain started at 10:15. Her sister called at noon. The fallen tree blocked the exact section of trail the voice had specified. The meeting with her supervisor happened at 2 p.m., discussing budget cuts she hadn't known were coming. The station was predicting the future by reporting it in reverse. She became obsessed. Every night at 9 p.m. she listened. The voice alternated between the woman and the man, sometimes describing her day, sometimes describing events in the wider world. They reported murders before they happened, accidents before they occurred, deaths before the victims knew they were dying. Always in reverse, always perfectly accurate. Linda started writing warnings, trying to prevent the tragedies the station predicted. She called the sheriff's office with anonymous tips about the car accident that would happen on Highway 441, about the house fire in Gatlinburg, about the lost hiker who would fall and break his leg on the Appalachian Trail. Some warnings were heeded. The hiker was found quickly because Linda had provided his exact location. But others went ignored, dismissed as crank calls, and Linda would read about the tragedies in the newspaper, knowing she'd heard them broadcast 24 hours earlier in perfect, horrifying reverse. Then the station broadcast something that made Linda understand why it existed and what was truly happening. The voice, the woman this time, began describing Linda's own death. In reverse. Starting with her funeral, working backward through the discovery of her body, backward through her final moments, backward through the hours leading to her death. She would die in 3 days. The voice provided every detail: the time, the location, the cause. Linda would fall from a cliff on the eastern ridge while investigating what she thought was a distress signal. No one would find her body for 5 days. Linda didn't sleep for the next 72 hours. She called in sick, refusing to leave her cabin, refusing to go anywhere near the eastern ridge. She kept her doors locked, her curtains drawn, waiting for the prophesied moment to pass. The appointed time came and went. Linda remained alive, unharmed, safe in her cabin. She'd beaten the prediction. She'd changed the future. The radio turned itself on at 9 p.m. that night. Linda hadn't touched it, but the speaker crackled to life, the volume rising until it was painfully loud. The woman's voice filled the cabin, no longer calm, no longer professional, angry, frustrated, speaking not in reverse but forward, in real time, directly to Linda. "You weren't supposed to hear us. You were supposed to die without knowing, like all the others. We report what is, not what could be. You've broken the sequence. You've created a gap. Now we must correct it." The broadcast dissolved into static, then resolved into a new voice. Linda's voice. Her own voice, reporting backward from a death that hadn't happened yet, describing a new timeline, a new ending. Tomorrow night, a fire, the cabin burning, no escape. The broadcast detailed every moment of her suffering, worked backward from discovery of her charred remains to the present moment, to now, to Linda standing in her cabin listening to her own death being reported like news that had already occurred. Linda grabbed her keys and ran for her Jeep. She would drive to town, stay with friends, never return to this cabin or this job. But the Jeep wouldn't start. Dead battery, though it had been fine hours earlier. Her phone, the landline, also dead. The road out had been washed away by a mudslide that hadn't been there at sunset. Every exit was closed, every path to safety eliminated. The station had reported her death in reverse, and reality was reshaping itself to match the broadcast, working backward from conclusion to cause, ensuring that what had been spoken would manifest. The cabin began to smell like smoke, though no fire had started. Linda could hear flames crackling in walls that showed no signs of burning. Heat rose around her, though the temperature gauge read 55 degrees. The radio continued broadcasting her death in reverse, and with each word spoken, the future became more fixed, more inevitable, more real than the present she occupied. Linda Hutchins did die in that fire. The official report blamed faulty wiring. Her body was found by a ranger conducting welfare checks after she'd missed 3 days of work. The investigation noted nothing unusual. No mention of a radio, though Linda's predecessor claimed he'd never owned one, had never left one behind, had never heard of a station that broadcast backwards through time, reporting what would be instead of what had been. The cabin was rebuilt and assigned to a new ranger. Sometimes, late at night, the replacement reports hearing music from the 1940s, faint and distant, coming from nowhere. She hasn't yet found the station, hasn't yet learned to listen for her future being reported in reverse. But she will. They always do. The station is patient. It has been broadcasting since before the mountains had names, will continue broadcasting long after they erode to nothing. It reports reality in reverse because that's the only direction truth flows in these mountains. Forward is possibility, backward is certainty. And once the station speaks your ending, the world reshapes itself to make those words into truth, working backward from death to life, from conclusion to cause, until you arrive at the moment you first heard your fate and understand too late that some broadcasts are not meant to be heard by the living. Story 4. The Children Who Never Aged. Pastor Daniel Yates accepted his assignment to the small church in rural Virginia with gratitude and humility. After 20 years serving larger congregations in Richmond, he'd requested a quieter posting where he could focus on spiritual matters without the politics and fundraising that dominated city ministry. The Mount Zion Baptist Church sat in a valley between two ridges in Tazewell County, serving a community of about 80 families scattered across the surrounding mountains. The congregation was aging, rarely more than 40 people at Sunday service, but they were devoted and welcoming. Daniel's first Sunday went smoothly. Familiar hymns, a sermon on grace and redemption, coffee and conversation afterward. But during that social hour, he noticed something odd. 5 children sat together at a corner table, drinking juice, not interacting with the other congregants. All appeared to be around 8 or 9 years old. 2 boys, 3 girls. They were well-behaved and quiet, wearing clothes that seemed slightly outdated, like something from a catalog from the 1980s. Daniel approached them, introducing himself, asking their names. The children stared at him with identical expressions of polite disinterest. The oldest girl, or the one who appeared oldest, spoke. "We're the Sunday school class, Pastor. We've always been the Sunday school class. We'll always be the Sunday school class." Before Daniel could ask what she meant, one of the church elders, Margaret Donovan, pulled him aside. She was 73, had attended Mount Zion her entire life, and spoke with the authority of someone who knew every secret the congregation held. She explained that those 5 children were special. They'd been coming to church for as long as anyone could remember. They never missed a Sunday. Their parents never accompanied them. They simply appeared each week, attended service, then disappeared until the following Sunday. Daniel asked the obvious questions. Who were their parents? Where did they live? Who had guardianship? Margaret's face went carefully neutral. She explained that some things in the mountains weren't meant to be questioned. Those children were part of Mount Zion's history. They'd been attending the church since before Margaret was born. Her grandmother had spoken of them. Records from 1923 mentioned them. Photographs from 1947 showed them looking exactly as they did today. They never aged. They never changed. They were the children of Mount Zion, and the church protected them by not asking questions that shouldn't be answered. Daniel's rationalist mind rejected the explanation. Children who never aged existed only in fiction. There had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps a family tradition where descendants wore the same style of clothing and attended the same church, creating an illusion of continuity. He decided to investigate carefully, to speak with the children individually to understand their situation. The next Sunday, he sought them out before service. They sat in the same corner, waiting. Daniel approached with his kindest pastoral manner and asked to speak with each of them privately. They agreed without resistance. He took the first child, a boy who introduced himself as Thomas, to his office. Daniel asked gentle questions. Where do you live? Who takes care of you? Do you go to school? Thomas answered each question with disturbing precision. I live in the Sunday school room, Pastor. I'm always here, even when you don't see me. I don't need taking care of. I don't go to school because I already know everything I need to know. I died in 1889. I was 9 years old. I got sick with scarlet fever, and my parents brought me to this church to pray for healing. I died during the prayer service, right there in the third pew, but I didn't leave. None of us left. We stay because we're supposed to. We're the children who guard the threshold. Daniel felt his skin crawl. The boy spoke with perfect sincerity, no indication of lying or delusion. Daniel asked what threshold he meant. Thomas smiled, and his teeth were too white, too perfect, like porcelain rather than enamel. He explained that Mount Zion sat on a thin place where the boundary between worlds was permeable. Something old and hungry lived beneath the church, trapped there by prayers and hymns and faith. The 5 children maintained the barrier, their presence a constant reminder to the thing below that it could not emerge as long as innocence remained above. Daniel dismissed the conversation as an elaborate story, possibly the result of adults filling children's heads with local folklore. But he felt compelled to investigate further. He researched church records going back through decades of ledgers and documents stored in the basement. He found photographs, yellowed and cracked, dating from 1923, 1947, 1965, 1983, 2001. In every photograph where children appeared, the same 5 faces stared at the camera. Thomas, Rebecca, Sarah, William, Grace, never aging, always wearing slightly outdated clothes, always positioned together, separate from other congregants. He found death certificates. All 5 children had died in the church between 1889 and 1921, all around age 9, all from various illnesses or accidents, all during services or church events. According to the records, they'd been buried in the church cemetery. Daniel walked among the graves and found their headstones, small and weathered, inscribed with their names and dates. But the earth above the graves was wrong. It bulged upward as if something below was pushing up, trying to emerge. Daniel pressed his hand to one mound and it was warm, far warmer than the October air could explain, and he felt movement beneath the soil, a slow, rhythmic pulsing like breathing. That night, Daniel returned to the church alone. He needed to understand, he needed rational explanation. He entered through the side door, turned on minimal lights, and made his way to the Sunday school room. The 5 children sat at their usual table, though it was Thursday night and the church should have been empty. They looked at him with sad, ancient eyes. Rebecca spoke this time. "You shouldn't be here, Pastor. It's not Sunday. We're only strong on Sunday when faith and voices fill the building. Tonight we're weak. Tonight it might hear you and wake fully." Daniel demanded answers. Who were they really? What was this thing they guarded? Rebecca explained with the patience of someone who'd repeated this story many times to many pastors over many decades. The church had been built on land that the Cherokee had considered cursed, a place where something emerged from the earth in the time before memory. Something that fed on faith, corrupted into fear, that grew strong when prayers turned desperate. The first congregation had built the church deliberately, sanctifying the ground, using prayer as a cage. But the thing below was patient and powerful. It had killed the 5 children, hoping their deaths would scatter the congregation, would close the church, would leave it unguarded. Instead, the children had stayed. Their spirits, their innocence, their deaths in the presence of prayer had bound them to this place. They became eternal guardians, children frozen forever in the moment between life and death, holding the threshold against what waited below. Every Sunday, the congregation's faith strengthened them. Every hymn renewed their power. Every prayer reinforced the barrier. As long as the church remained active, as long as people gathered and believed, the children could maintain their watch. Daniel asked what would happen if the church closed, if the congregation dwindled until services stopped. The children looked at each other, then back at him. Grace, who hadn't spoken before, whispered in a voice like wind through grass, "It will rise, it will emerge, and it will spread through these mountains like infection, corrupting every church, every prayer, every moment of faith into channels for its hunger. We 5 hold it here in this small space. We die every moment of every day, endlessly, holding our deaths like shields against its ascent. If we fail, if we fade, if we're finally allowed to rest, it will consume everything that believes in anything." Daniel staggered from the church into the parking lot, his worldview crumbling. He drove home, tried to sleep, tried to convince himself he'd experienced a stress-induced hallucination. But Sunday came, and the 5 children appeared again, sitting in their corner, drinking their juice, maintaining their eternal watch. Daniel Yates served Mount Zion for 3 more years. He never again spoke to the children about their nature. He focused his ministry on keeping the congregation strong, on attracting new members, on ensuring that services never stopped, that hymns continued, that prayer flowed. Because he'd felt it that Thursday night. When he'd left the church and paused at the threshold, he'd heard something beneath the building, a vast, patient breathing. A presence aware of him, curious about his fear, hungry for the faith that bound it. He retired in 2021 and moved to Florida, as far from the Appalachian Mountains as he could get. The new pastor is younger, energetic, unaware of the burden she's inherited. The congregation continues to dwindle. 40 members have become 30, then 20. The children still appear every Sunday, but Daniel noticed before he left that they're fading, becoming translucent, their voices weaker. They're tired after guarding the threshold for over a century. They want to rest. They want release. And when the congregation finally shrinks to the point where faith can no longer sustain them, when the last hymn echoes in an empty church, the 5 children will finally be allowed to die completely. And something that has waited patiently in the darkness, beneath a small Baptist church in the mountains of Virginia, will rise into a world unprepared for what believing can become when faith turns hungry, and prayers become doors rather than shields. Story 5. The Road That Remembers. Vincent Torres had been driving for a medical transport company for 8 years, covering night shifts through the mountains of North Carolina. His route involved picking up patients from rural clinics and delivering them to hospitals in Asheville, usually elderly people needing dialysis or chemotherapy. It was steady work, paid decently, and Vincent appreciated the solitude of night driving through winding mountain roads. He knew his route perfectly, every curve and straightaway, every landmark and warning sign. Highway 209 between Hot Springs and Marshall was his primary corridor, a 23-mile stretch he'd driven hundreds of times. The night of January 15, 2020, Vincent picked up his last passenger at 11 p.m., an elderly woman named Dorothy Kensington who needed transport to Mission Hospital for emergency treatment. She was quiet, medicated, resting in the back of his van on a stretcher. The night was clear and cold, temperature in the low 20s, roads dry. Vincent headed south on Highway 209, expecting to reach Marshall in 30 minutes. At the 12-mile mark, Vincent noticed the road looked different. The asphalt seemed newer, smoother, with reflective paint that gleamed too brightly in his headlights. The trees along the shoulder were wrong, taller and older than they should be. He checked his odometer and GPS. Both confirmed he was on Highway 209, but the landscape didn't match his memory. He slowed down, confused but not yet alarmed. Then he saw the car. A blue sedan sat sideways across both lanes, doors open, headlights still on. No people visible, no sign of collision or breakdown. Just an abandoned vehicle blocking the road. Vincent stopped, put on his hazard lights, and approached cautiously. The sedan was a 1987 Toyota Camry, light blue with North Carolina plates. The interior was clean, keys still in the ignition, engine warm. On the dashboard sat a cell phone, but not a modern smartphone, one of the old flip phones from the early 2000s. The phone's screen showed a date, March 23, 2003. Vincent returned to his van and grabbed his radio to call dispatch. No response. Static only. His cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in these mountains, but his GPS had stopped working entirely. The screen frozen on a map that showed roads in locations that didn't match the terrain around him. He checked on Dorothy. She remained unconscious, vitals stable on the portable monitor. He decided to carefully maneuver his van around the abandoned sedan and continue. As he pulled back onto the road, his headlights swept across something that made him stop breathing. There were people standing in the trees, dozens of them. Men, women, children, standing perfectly still, watching him. They wore clothing from different eras, dresses from the 1950s, suits from the 1970s, overalls from Depression-era photographs. All of them were soaked, water dripping from their clothes and hair, forming puddles at their feet despite the freezing temperature. Vincent accelerated, his van fishtailing slightly as he fled. The people in the trees didn't move, didn't react, just watched with expressions of profound sadness. He drove for what felt like 10 minutes but should have brought him to Marshall. Instead, he found himself approaching the same abandoned blue sedan, blocking the road in exactly the same position. Impossible. He'd driven south. The road didn't loop. But there was the sedan, the open doors, the warm engine, the cell phone showing March 23, 2003. Vincent's training kicked in. He was experiencing some kind of medical emergency. Carbon monoxide exposure, stroke, hallucination. He checked the van's CO detector. Normal. He checked his own pulse and coordination. Normal. Dorothy remained stable, but the sedan sat there, impossible and undeniable, and when he looked in his rearview mirror, the wet people from the trees were standing on the road behind him, blocking his retreat. He grabbed a flashlight and walked back to confront them. Irrationality overwhelming reason. As he approached, they didn't move or speak. Up close, Vincent could see their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were empty, reflecting his flashlight like animal eyes but without any internal awareness. The closest figure was a young woman in a sundress from the 1960s. Water streamed from her clothes continuously, forming a puddle that should have drained away but instead spread slowly across the asphalt. Vincent asked what they wanted, his voice shaking. The young woman's mouth moved, but no sound emerged. Instead, he heard her voice inside his head, not words, but pure meaning. A direct transmission of thought and memory. She died here. They'd all died here. Over decades, over a century, this stretch of Highway 209 had claimed lives. Car accidents, drownings when the French Broad River flooded and covered the road. Murders, suicides, strokes and heart attacks behind the wheel. Every violent or unexpected death on this road left something behind. A recording in the asphalt itself, in the trees, in the very substance of the place. The road remembered. And on certain nights when conditions aligned in ways the woman couldn't explain, the road replayed its memories. Anyone traveling through during these replays became part of the loop, trapped in a temporal echo where the past bled into the present, where every tragedy recorded by this stretch of highway manifested simultaneously, overlapping, creating a maze of death memories through which the living had to navigate. Vincent asked how to escape. The woman's thoughts flooded his mind. He had to find the moment that didn't belong, the one event. That broke the pattern, the memory that was still malleable. Most replays were fixed, unchangeable recordings. But one event in the loop remained unresolved, its outcome still undecided. If he could find that moment and alter it, he could break the cycle, collapse the replay, and return to real time. She showed him a vision. Somewhere in this loop there was a real accident happening right now in present time, a collision between two vehicles that would kill 3 people. That accident existed simultaneously in the future of the real timeline and the present of the replay. If Vincent could reach it, prevent it, change its outcome, the temporal tension would snap and the loop would collapse. Vincent ran back to his van. Dorothy was still unconscious, but now her monitor showed anomalies. Her vital signs were rewinding, time stamping backward as if her body was de-aging. Vincent started the van and drove, passing the blue sedan again, watching the wet figures in his mirrors. He drove faster, ignoring the landscape's repetition, looking for something different, something that didn't belong to the past. He found it 3 loops later. Fresh skid marks on the road, broken glass, two vehicles, a pickup truck and a minivan, positioned at angles suggesting an imminent collision but frozen in the instant before impact. No drivers visible, but Vincent understood. This was the moment. This accident existed in quantum superposition, happening and not happening simultaneously. The replay had captured it before resolution. Vincent positioned his van between the two vehicles. If they collided, they would pass through his van through the space he occupied because he existed in the replay, not the real timeline. But Dorothy existed in both. Her body, her presence, was an anchor to real time. If the vehicles collided through her, she would die and the accident would resolve in tragedy. But if Vincent could prevent the collision by making Dorothy part of the physical barrier, her reality might stabilize the moment, prevent the crash, alter the outcome. He moved Dorothy's stretcher to the road, positioning her between the vehicles. He stood beside her, holding her hand, feeling her pulse against his palm, using her living heartbeat as an anchor to pull himself back into real time. The frozen vehicles began to move, drawn forward by the gravity of the inevitable collision. Vincent closed his eyes and prayed to gods he didn't believe in, bargaining with a universe that didn't negotiate. The vehicles struck Dorothy's stretcher. Vincent felt the impact as a wave of force that should have killed them both. But instead of collision, there was a sound like glass breaking on a cosmic scale, a shattering of temporal barriers, and the world reset. Vincent fell to his knees on cold asphalt. Dorothy's stretcher lay intact beside him. The two vehicles had stopped, inches from her stretcher, drivers climbing out, confused and shaken, but alive. Behind them, the wet figures from the trees were fading, their forms dissolving like reflections when the water is disturbed. Vincent checked Dorothy. She was alive, stable, confused about why she was lying on a stretcher in the middle of Highway 209 at 1:30 a.m. His GPS worked again. His cell phone showed normal time. The blue sedan was gone. The landscape matched his memories. He loaded Dorothy back into the van and drove to Marshall without further incident, arriving at Mission Hospital 40 minutes late. His supervisor demanded explanation for the delay. Vincent said he'd encountered a road closure and had to wait. What else could he say? He still drives for the medical transport company, still covers the night shift, still travels Highway 209. But now he watches for signs of the replay starting again. Sometimes at the 12-mile mark, he sees the asphalt shimmer, sees trees that are too old, sees reflections in puddles that don't match the sky. When that happens, he takes an alternate route no matter how much longer it takes, because he knows the road remembers everything. Every death, every tragedy, every moment of fear and pain. And sometimes, when conditions align, the road shares those memories with anyone foolish enough to travel through its darkest hours, trapping them in loops of recorded horror until they either escape or become permanent additions to the replay. Another wet figure standing in the trees, watching the next travelers approach, hoping someone else can break the cycle they never could. Story 6. The Mirror in the Abandoned Hospital. Rachel Kincaid explored abandoned buildings for her YouTube channel, documenting the decay of forgotten structures across Appalachia. She'd gained a modest following, about 15,000 subscribers, by posting videos of old schools, closed factories, and defunct shopping malls. Her content focused on architecture and history, avoiding the exploitative ghost hunting angle that dominated the abandoned exploration genre. She researched her locations thoroughly, obtained permission when possible, and treated each site with respect. In March 2021, she received a tip about an abandoned psychiatric hospital in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, closed in 1987 after decades of patient abuse scandals. The Whitmore Hospital sat on 200 acres of forested land, accessible only by a washed-out road that Rachel's pickup truck barely managed. The main building was a 4-story brick structure with broken windows and a collapsed section of roof. Smaller outbuildings dotted the property, including patient cottages, a power plant, and a morgue. Rachel planned to spend the day documenting the site, starting with the main building's interior. She entered through a ground-floor window, her camera recording everything. The interior matched her expectations: peeling paint, collapsed ceilings, graffiti, evidence of vandalism and weather damage. She moved through corridors carefully, testing floorboards, aware of structural instability. The first 3 floors yielded good footage, but nothing unusual. Standard abandonment documentation. The 4th floor was different. The damage was less severe here, as if this level had been sealed off before the elements penetrated lower floors. The paint was faded but intact. The doors still hung on their hinges, and the rooms were still furnished. Not stripped bare like psychiatric hospitals usually were after closure, but fully equipped with beds, chairs, restraints still bolted to walls. Rachel's unease grew. This wasn't normal. Someone should have cleared this equipment decades ago. At the end of the corridor, she found a room labeled hydrotherapy. Inside, a large porcelain tub sat in the center, surrounded by mechanical equipment for temperature control and water pressure. But what captured Rachel's attention was the mirror. A full-length mirror, 6 feet tall, set into the wall in an ornate wooden frame, completely intact despite the decades of abandonment. The glass was clean, no dust or grime, reflecting Rachel's image with perfect clarity. She approached the mirror, camera raised, documenting the anomaly. As she filmed, she noticed something wrong with her reflection. It lagged. Not by much, maybe half a second, but enough to be perceptible. She raised her hand. Her reflection raised its hand a beat late. She stepped closer. Her reflection moved a moment after she did. Rachel stopped moving entirely, standing still. Her reflection continued moving, stepping closer to the glass from the other side until it pressed its palm against the mirror's surface. Rachel stumbled backward. Her reflection didn't follow. It remained at the mirror, palm pressed to glass, staring at her with an expression that wasn't quite her own. The face was hers. The body was hers. But something in the eyes was different. Empty, hungry, aware in a way that suggested it wasn't a reflection at all, but something else wearing her appearance. She turned to leave, and the mirror exploded. Glass shattered outward, spraying across the room, and Rachel's reflection stepped through the frame into the real world. It moved wrong, joints bending at angles that human bodies couldn't achieve, head tilting too far, eyes tracking Rachel with predatory focus. It opened its mouth and sound emerged, but not her voice. It was dozens of voices speaking in unison, all saying the same thing. "We've been waiting for you to visit. We've been waiting for someone to see us. We've been trapped in the reflections for so long." Rachel ran. The thing that wore her face pursued, moving with that wrong, jointed gait, speaking in its chorus of voices. She fled down the corridor, her camera still recording in her hand through pure instinct. Behind her, other mirrors in other rooms began shattering. The hospital had dozens of mirrors. Bathrooms, medical exam rooms, reflection surfaces everywhere. And, from each one, something emerged. Figures that resembled people but weren't. Things that had been trapped in the reflective surfaces for decades, waiting for someone to look closely enough to notice the lag, to break the barrier between reflection and reality. Rachel reached the stairwell and descended, taking steps 3 at a time. The things followed, their voices echoing through the empty building, calling her name in harmonies that human vocal cords couldn't produce. She emerged on the 3rd floor and made a critical error. She glanced at a window, saw her reflection in the remaining glass, and something grabbed her from inside the reflection, pulling her toward the surface. She felt hands, dozens of hands reaching from behind the glass trying to drag her through into whatever space existed behind mirrors. She broke free, smashing the window with her camera, and continued running. The second floor. The first floor. The exit she'd climbed through earlier. Rachel dove through the window opening and rolled onto the ground outside. She ran for her truck, not looking back, not checking to see if the things followed. Inside her pickup, doors locked, engine running, Rachel finally looked at the hospital. Figures stood at every window. Her reflection and dozens of others all watching her with those empty, hungry eyes. They pressed against the glass from inside, leaving handprints that shouldn't exist. And in the fading afternoon light, Rachel saw more details. The figures weren't just wearing her face. They wore the faces of other explorers, other visitors, other people who'd come to this hospital over the years since closure. Each mirror had captured someone, trapped their reflection, kept it alive in the glass while the original person left, unknowing, unaware that they'd left part of themselves behind. Rachel drove away, but she couldn't leave what she'd experienced. She reviewed her camera footage that night in her motel room. The video showed everything. The mirror, the lag, the shattering, the figures emerging. It showed the things chasing her, their wrong movements, their chorus voices. But it also showed something that Rachel hadn't noticed during her escape. In every reflection she'd passed, in every piece of glass, every shiny surface, a copy of her had split off. Dozens of Rachel reflections left behind in the hospital, trapped in the mirrors, doomed to wait for the next visitor to notice them, to acknowledge them, to potentially free them. The real question, the one that kept Rachel awake that night and every night since, was whether she was the original. Or was she one of the reflections that had escaped? Was the real Rachel still in that hospital, trapped in the ornate mirror in the hydrotherapy room, pressing her palm against the glass, watching her reflection live the life she should have lived? Rachel stopped making videos. She closed her YouTube channel, deleted her social media, and tried to disappear into anonymity. But she can't avoid mirrors. They're everywhere. Bathrooms, stores, car windows, phone screens. And in every reflection she sees that half-second lag, that moment of delay that suggests the thing staring back isn't quite synchronized with her movements. Sometimes late at night she catches her reflection looking at her when she's not looking at it. Sees her reflection's lips move without her moving them. Hears whispers from bathroom mirrors when she's alone in her apartment. She's called psychiatric professionals, tried to explain her experience, been prescribed medications for psychosis and dissociation. But medication doesn't fix what happened in that hospital. It doesn't erase the footage on her camera, the video evidence that she can't bring herself to delete or share. And it doesn't answer the fundamental question that haunts her every time she sees her reflection. If dozens of Rachels were left behind in those mirrors and one escaped, how can she be certain she's the original? How can any of us be certain that the person staring back from the mirror is a reflection and not the real thing? While we're the copies, the escaped reflections, living lives that don't belong to us, wearing faces we stole from people still trapped behind the glass, waiting for someone to finally look closely enough to notice the lag and understand that mirrors don't reflect. They capture, they contain, and they never ever forget what they've taken. Story 7. The Thing That Followed from the Smoke. Curtis Brennan fought wildfires for the U.S. Forest Service, part of a hotshot crew based out of Southern Virginia. He'd spent 12 seasons battling blazes across the Appalachian Mountains, enduring smoke and heat and exhaustion that most people couldn't comprehend. October 2020 brought an unusual fire season. A drought had left the mountains tinder dry, and a series of lightning strikes sparked multiple fires that merged into a single conflagration, consuming over 10,000 acres in the George Washington National Forest. Curtis's crew was deployed to cut fire breaks and perform backburns, controlled fires meant to starve the wildfire of fuel. They worked in 24-hour shifts, rotating between active firefighting and brief rest periods. On the fourth day, Curtis's team was cutting line on a ridge when they encountered something that wasn't burning the way fire should burn. A section of forest approximately 200 yards in diameter was on fire, but the flames were wrong. They burned black instead of orange, producing smoke that didn't rise but flowed downward like liquid, pooling in the hollows, moving with apparent purpose. The trees within this section weren't being consumed. They were transforming, bark turning to something that resembled charred flesh, branches writhing in the heat, leaves falling as ash that reformed into shapes that suggested wings or hands before dispersing. Curtis's crew chief, a veteran named Patricia Hooks, radioed the observation to command. The response was immediate. Evacuate the area. Don't approach the anomalous fire. A specialized team would investigate. But before Curtis's crew could retreat, the black smoke surged forward, flowing uphill against natural physics, engulfing two crew members, Derek Paulson and Amy Trent. They disappeared into the smoke, their screams cutting off abruptly. Patricia ordered the remaining crew to run. They fled down the ridge, but the black smoke followed, moving faster than any forest fire should move, pursuing them with deliberate intent. Curtis glanced back and saw shapes forming in the smoke. Humanoid figures with too many limbs, faces that were almost recognizable but wrong, distorted, as if the smoke was trying to remember what people looked like but couldn't quite get the proportions right. The crew reached their vehicles and evacuated to the base camp. Derek and Amy never emerged from the smoke. Search teams went in after the anomalous fire burned out 3 days later. They found Derek and Amy in the section of forest where the black flames had burned. Both were alive, physically unharmed, but changed in ways that medical professionals couldn't explain and psychiatric professionals refused to accept. Derek and Amy couldn't speak. Their voices produced only sounds like wind through burned timber, like smoke moving through tight spaces. Their eyes had changed, pupils elongated vertically like a cat's, reflecting light in the dark. And they were never alone. Something followed them. Not a physical presence that others could see, but an absence. A space where perception failed, where observers' eyes would slide away, refusing to focus. Cameras captured it as a blur of darkness that resembled human-shaped smoke. Animals reacted to it, fleeing or attacking hysterically. Within a week, Derek hanged himself in his hospital room. He left no note, but security footage showed something standing beside him while he tied the noose. A shadow shape made of absence and smoke, its hands guiding his hands, its form merging with his until it was impossible to tell where Derek ended and the thing began. Amy survived longer. She was transferred to a psychiatric facility, restrained, medicated. But the thing that followed her remained. Staff reported seeing smoke in her room despite no possible source. Her reflection in mirrors showed additional figures standing behind her, watching. And when she finally died 3 months later from what the autopsy called spontaneous internal combustion, her body burning from the inside out with black flames that consumed her completely, leaving only ash that reformed briefly into her shape before dispersing. Curtis knew that what had taken them in that forest was still hungry. He resigned from the Forest Service and tried to forget. But 6 months later, Curtis started noticing the smell. Smoke. Not wood, smoke or cigarette smoke, but something organic and wrong, like burning meat mixed with burning hair. The smell followed him everywhere. His apartment, his car, his new job at a hardware store. And with the smell came the feeling of being watched. He'd catch glimpses in his peripheral vision. A figure made of dark smoke standing in corners and doorways, always at the edge of perception, never quite visible when looked at directly. Curtis visited the site where the anomalous fire had burned. The forest had regrown, but the section where the black flames had been remained bare, the earth scorched and lifeless. and in the center of that dead zone, Curtis found a symbol burned into the bedrock itself, a mark that hurt to look at, geometric shapes that suggested depth and dimension impossible for two-dimensional carvings. The symbol radiated cold despite the summer heat, and the air around it shimmered with heat distortion running in reverse, as if it was absorbing thermal energy rather than releasing it. Curtis photographed the symbol and researched it obsessively. He found references in obscure folklore, in testimonies from other Forest Service personnel who'd encountered anomalous fires over the decades. The fires weren't natural. They were emergence events. Something that lived in a layer of reality adjacent to ours, something that existed as pure consumption and heat, occasionally broke through into our world when conditions aligned. Forest fires provided camouflage, allowed it to manifest without drawing attention, let it hunt for people to take back with it. The black smoke was its method of transport. Anyone engulfed by it became marked, became channels through which it could extend its presence into our reality. Derek and Amy hadn't been possessed. They'd been converted, turned into doorways, their bodies maintained as anchors while the thing wore their consciousness like gloves. And when it finished using them, it discarded them, burning them with black flames that sent their converted substance back to wherever it came from. Curtis understood that he was marked too. His exposure to the black smoke, his proximity to Derek and Amy after their conversion, had made him visible to the thing. The smell of smoke, the glimpsed shadows, the feeling of being watched were symptoms of its attention. It was following him, studying him, deciding whether he was worth taking. He tried every form of protection, salt lines, religious symbols. Sage burning. Nothing affected the thing. It existed in a state between material and energy, between presence and absence. It couldn't be blocked because it wasn't quite physical. It couldn't be reasoned with because it wasn't conscious in any way humans understood consciousness. It was hunger and heat given semi-permanent form, and it wanted Curtis for reasons he couldn't comprehend. The taking happened in August 2021. Curtis woke one night to find his bedroom filled with black smoke. Not smoke he was breathing, not smoke that burned his eyes, but smoke that existed in the same space as normal air, overlapping reality rather than displacing it. The thing stood at the foot of his bed, fully manifested, a figure made of darkness and absence, shaped roughly like a human but too tall, too thin, with too many joints in its limbs and too many fingers on its hands. It reached for him, and Curtis felt heat that wasn't physical, burning that didn't char his flesh but consumed something else, something deeper. His consciousness, his sense of self, was being pulled from his body like smoke drawn up a chimney. He felt himself dispersing, spreading out, losing cohesion. His memories became confused. Was he Curtis Brennan, firefighter? Or was he something older, something that had been burning in the mountains since before humans named them? Something that occasionally wore human skin to remember what it felt like to be bound and limited and alive. When firefighters found Curtis 3 days later, he was sitting in his apartment, unresponsive, eyes reflecting light in the dark. He couldn't speak except in sounds like wind and smoke. His medical scans showed normal brain activity, but something was wrong at a level instruments couldn't measure. His body remained alive, breathing, eating when fed, but Curtis Brennan wasn't home anymore. He'd been taken, converted, turned into another doorway through which the thing from the black smoke could extend its presence. He's still alive in a care facility in Richmond. His parents visit sometimes, hoping for recognition that never comes. Staff report smelling smoke around him constantly. Cameras malfunction in his presence. And on his skin, just above his heart, a symbol has appeared, geometric and impossible, identical to the mark burned into the bedrock where the anomalous fire consumed Derek and Amy. The symbol shifts slightly when observed, suggesting depth that extends beyond Curtis's flesh, down through layers of reality, connecting him to something vast and hungry that burns in dimensions we can't see, waiting for the next fire season, the next emergence, the next opportunity to manifest in our world and select new vessels to carry it forward, spreading through the Appalachian Mountains like a contagion made of heat and darkness, converting the living into doorways, turning flesh into smoke, smoke into absence. Absence into a hunger that can never be satisfied because it isn't truly hunger but the universe's slow consumption of itself. And we're all fuel waiting for the moment when the black flames find us and burn away everything we are, leaving only the shape of what we were, reformed briefly in ash before dispersing forever into the spaces between what is and what burns. Story 8. The Woman Who Came Back Wrong. Ethan Mercer worked as an emergency medical technician in rural West Virginia, covering a territory that stretched across 3 counties of sparse population and difficult terrain. He'd seen every kind of medical emergency rural Appalachia produced: farming accidents, overdoses, domestic violence, vehicle collisions. 16 years of service had hardened him against shock, but nothing prepared him for the call he received on November 3, 2018. The dispatch came at 2:15 a.m. A single vehicle accident on County Road 12, driver reported as conscious but injured, location remote. Ethan and his partner, Michelle Torres, responded in their ambulance, navigating the winding mountain road carefully. They found the vehicle exactly where dispatch indicated. A Honda CR-V rolled onto its side in a ditch, airbags deployed, windshield shattered. A woman sat on the roadside approximately 30 feet from the wreck, her back to them, completely still. Ethan approached with his medical kit, announcing his presence. The woman didn't respond. As he moved closer, he noted unusual details. She wore a dress, formal and outdated, like something from the 1950s. Her hair was styled in victory rolls, immaculate despite having just been in a rollover accident. No visible blood, no obvious injuries. She was humming, a tune Ethan didn't recognize, soft and unsettling. He knelt beside her and asked if she was hurt. She turned to face him, and Ethan's professional composure cracked. The woman was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at, features too symmetrical, skin too perfect, eyes too large and too dark. She smiled, revealing teeth that were uniformly white and slightly too sharp. When she spoke, her voice had a strange quality, like it was coming from slightly behind her, like an audio track not quite synchronized with her mouth movements. "I'm fine now. I wasn't fine before, but I came back and now I'm fine." Ethan ran through his assessment protocol by reflex, checking her pupils, her pulse, her responses. Everything read as normal but wrong. Her pupils didn't dilate properly. Her pulse was too slow, barely 40 beats per minute, yet she showed no signs of bradycardia distress. Her skin was cold, far colder than the November night air could explain, as if she'd been sitting in a freezer. Michelle approached with a spine board, standard procedure for accident victims. The woman looked at the board and laughed, a sound like wind chimes made from glass. She stood without assistance, moving with fluid grace that suggested no injuries whatsoever. She gestured toward the overturned CR-V. "That body in the car is dead. I left it there. This body is much better." Ethan and Michelle exchanged looks. They moved to the vehicle and looked inside. A woman's body remained trapped in the driver's seat, held by the seatbelt, neck bent at an angle incompatible with life. The face was ruined, crushed against the deployed airbag and shattered windshield. But the clothes matched. The same 1950s dress, the same hairstyle, now matted with blood. The dead woman in the car was identical to the living woman standing on the roadside. Michelle radioed for police backup, her voice shaking. Ethan tried to process what he was seeing. Twins? One threw from the vehicle, the other dead inside? But no, the dress was identical, down to a specific tear in the hem. The hairstyle was the same, including a distinctive pin shaped like a butterfly. The woman on the roadside began walking toward them, still smiling that too sharp smile. "You're confused. That's normal. People always are when they see me adjust. I died in the crash, but I didn't want to be dead, so I came back. I found a better version waiting nearby and I moved into it. This body works much better than the one that broke." Ethan tried to apply rational explanation. Brain injury, dissociation, psychotic break. But he'd seen brain injuries, and this wasn't that. The woman moved toward the ambulance, opened the back doors, and climbed inside as if she were simply a patient accepting transport. Ethan and Michelle had no protocol for this situation. They loaded the spine board with the dead woman's body from the vehicle and secured it beside the living woman, who watched the process with detached interest. During the drive to the hospital, the living woman talked. She explained that she'd been driving to visit family when a deer appeared in the road. She'd swerved, lost control, rolled the vehicle. She'd felt her neck snap, felt her consciousness separating from her body. But instead of darkness, she'd found herself standing beside the wreck, looking at her dead body, and beside that vision of herself stood another version. Cleaner. Undamaged. Waiting. She'd simply stepped into it like changing clothes. Ethan asked if she was claiming to be a ghost. She laughed that glass chime laugh again. Not a ghost. Something else. Something that had always existed alongside her, but separate, invisible. Everyone had them, she explained. Alternate versions, parallel selves, existing in the spaces between moments, between decisions, between lives. Most people never saw them because most people never died suddenly enough to catch a glimpse of what waited in the gap. But she had died, and in that instant before total cessation, she'd seen the others, the versions of herself that existed in probability rather than actuality, and she'd grabbed one and pulled it into reality to replace the body that had broken. At the hospital, staff examined both the living woman and the dead one. Fingerprints matched. DNA matched, dental records matched. The dead woman was Rebecca Sorensen, 38 years old, from Charleston. The living woman was also Rebecca Sorensen, identical in every measurable way. Police investigated, suspecting twin sister identity fraud, but records showed Rebecca had no siblings. Birth certificate listed a single birth. Parents confirmed they'd had only one daughter, and this woman was her, alive, impossible. Rebecca was released after 72 hours of psychiatric observation. Doctors found no pathology, no explanation. She returned to her life, to her job, to her family. But Ethan followed up, compelled by what he'd witnessed. He interviewed Rebecca's husband, her parents, her friends. They all confirmed she was different, small changes. She didn't remember certain events. She had preferences that had reversed. She'd been allergic to shellfish before, now she ate it without reaction. She'd been left-handed, now she favored her right. Subtle alterations suggesting this wasn't quite the same Rebecca who'd climbed into that Honda CR-V. Her husband divorced her 6 months later. He couldn't articulate why, except that sleeping beside her felt like sleeping beside a stranger. Something wearing his wife's face but hollow beneath it. Rebecca accepted the divorce without emotion and moved to a different city. Ethan tracked her through public records, an obsession he couldn't justify. She changed jobs frequently, changed homes, changed names. With each iteration, she moved further from the original Rebecca Sorensen, as if the version she'd grabbed from the gap wasn't stable, was slowly degrading or transforming into something else entirely. Ethan began researching similar cases. He found scattered reports. People who survived accidents they shouldn't have survived, emerging uninjured from wreckage that should have killed them. Victims of shootings who walked away without wounds. drowning victims pulled from water hours after they should have died, alive and conscious. In every case, family and friends reported the survivors were different afterward, changed in small ways that accumulated into profound alienness. He found documentation of a theory, buried in obscure medical literature and suppressed folklore. The idea that human consciousness existed in quantum superposition, that every possible version of a person existed simultaneously until observed and collapsed into a single state. Death was supposed to be the final collapse, ending all possibilities. But sometimes, during violent, unexpected death, the collapse failed. The dying consciousness glimpsed the other versions and, in desperation, grabbed one and pulled it through, dragging a probability into actuality. But the replacement was never perfect. It was a version from a slightly different timeline, where choices had varied, where the person had developed along a divergent path. It was them but not them, close enough to pass superficial inspection but fundamentally other. And the longer they existed in our timeline, the more unstable they became, reality slowly recognizing the error and trying to correct it. Ethan lost track of Rebecca in 2020. Her last known address was in Tennessee, but when he drove there to check, the apartment was abandoned. Neighbors reported she'd left suddenly in the middle of the night without taking her possessions. They described strange sounds from her apartment in the weeks before she vanished. Multiple voices, all hers, having conversations with herself. Lights that flickered in patterns that suggested signals, shadows that moved independently of her body. Ethan returned home and tried to resume his normal life. But now he looked at his patients differently. Every accident victim, every person pulled from the edge of death, he wondered, are you the original? Or did you grab a replacement from the gap and drag it through? And if everyone has these alternate versions existing in the spaces between possibility and reality, how many of us have already been replaced without knowing, dragged through by our dying originals, wearing lives that don't quite fit, slowly degrading as reality recognizes we're errors, glitches, versions that shouldn't exist in this timeline but persist because no one has figured out how to send us back to the probability spaces where we belong? He sees Rebecca sometimes in crowds, in passing cars, in reflections, never quite close enough to confirm, always slightly wrong. Too perfect, too sharp, moving with that fluid grace that suggests she's still adjusting to physical existence. And he wonders if the Rebecca he met on County Road 12 is still out there, still stable, or if she's fragmented into multiple versions existing in several places simultaneously, spreading like a virus through reality, each version slightly more degraded than the last, until eventually all that will remain is the space where Rebecca Sorensen should be. A gap shaped like a woman, a hole in the world that wears her face and walks among us, recruiting others, showing them how to see their alternate versions, how to reach into the gap when death comes, how to grab a replacement and pull it through, how to come back wrong and keep living anyway because anything is better than the darkness, even existence as an error. Even wearing a life that belongs to a version of yourself from a timeline where you made different choices and became someone you don't recognize when you look in mirrors and see too many reflections looking back. Each one slightly different, each one claiming to be the real you. And no way to know which one is telling the truth or if truth even matters when reality is just the version of yourself that persists long enough to forget you were ever anyone else. Story 9. The photographs that developed backwards. Miranda Shaw worked at an estate sale company in the mountains of North Carolina, specializing in clearing out homes of deceased persons with no living heirs. Her job involved cataloging possessions, appraising valuables, and organizing sales. It was somber work, handling the accumulated artifacts of finished lives, but Miranda found it meaningful. A way of honoring the dead by ensuring their possessions found new purposes. In February 2019, she was assigned to clear a property outside Boone. a small farmhouse that had belonged to a photographer named Gerald Wickham, who died alone at age 87. The farmhouse was cluttered with decades of accumulated equipment. Cameras from every era, from large format view cameras to modern digital equipment. Developing trays and chemical bottles. Filing cabinets filled with negatives and contact sheets. And photographs. Thousands of photographs covering every surface, filling boxes stacked in closets. Gerald had been a landscape photographer documenting the Appalachian Mountains across 6 decades. Miranda began the process of sorting them, identifying anything with commercial or historical value. In Gerald's darkroom, a converted bathroom with blackout curtains and vintage enlargers, Miranda found something unusual. A developing tray sat on the counter, still filled with chemical solution, with a single photograph floating in the fluid. The chemicals should have evaporated decades ago, but the solution was fresh, still working, and the photograph was developing. Not developing normally, but in reverse. The image was disappearing, fading from full exposure back to blank paper. Miranda watched, fascinated and disturbed, as the photograph erased itself over the course of several minutes. When it finished, the paper was completely blank, pristine white. She lifted it from the solution with tongs, and immediately the process reversed. The image began reappearing, developing up from nothing. But the picture that emerged wasn't the same one that had faded. This photograph showed Gerald's farmhouse, but different, older. The paint was brighter, the yard more manicured, and a woman stood on the porch, a woman Miranda didn't recognize from any other photographs. Miranda set the photograph aside and continued her work, convincing herself she'd misperceived, that fatigue had caused a trick of perception. But that evening, as she was preparing to leave, she checked the photograph again. It had changed. The same farmhouse, same woman. But now the woman was closer to the camera, her face more visible. She was looking directly at the lens, her expression urgent, her mouth open as if shouting something the photograph couldn't convey. Miranda took the photograph home, along with several boxes of Gerald's negatives to catalog at her apartment. She placed the strange photograph on her kitchen table and went to bed. During the night, she woke to sound, not loud but persistent, a clicking sound, rhythmic, like a camera shutter. She followed the sound to her kitchen and found the photograph had changed again. The woman was now at the edge of the frame, as if she'd walked out of the image, and behind her in the farmhouse's window a figure stood, dark, indistinct, watching. Miranda turned on all her lights and examined the photograph closely. The image quality was strange, too detailed, as if it had been taken with equipment that didn't exist in the era the scene depicted. She could see individual leaves on trees, read the grain in the wood siding, see the woman's irises. And the woman was moving, not animated like a video, but shifting between moments, as if the photograph was capturing multiple points in time simultaneously. The next morning, Miranda researched Gerald Wickham. She found scattered information. He'd been a respected landscape photographer in the 1960s and 70s, but his career had ended abruptly in 1983 after his wife disappeared. Margaret Wickham had vanished from their farmhouse without trace, and Gerald had become a recluse afterward, rarely leaving the property, continuing to photograph but never showing or selling his work. Miranda returned to the farmhouse and searched more carefully. In Gerald's bedroom, she found journals. Decades of entries, increasingly illegible, describing his obsession with a single question. Can photography capture time, not just freeze it, but contain it, trap it, allow movement between moments? He'd been experimenting with modified chemical formulas, altered exposure techniques, trying to create photographs that weren't merely records but portals, windows into the moments they depicted. According to his journals, Gerald believed he'd succeeded in 1983. He developed a formula that made photographs temporal rather than static. The images would continue to exist in their own time stream, continuing forward from the moment of exposure. And if the formula worked as intended, someone could enter the photograph, step into the frozen moment and experience it as present time. Margaret had volunteered to test the process. Gerald had photographed her on their porch, developed the image with his experimental solution, and Margaret had touched the wet photograph. She disappeared instantly, drawn into the image, and Gerald had spent the rest of his life trying to bring her back. Miranda found the negative. It was in a protective sleeve labeled with Margaret's name and a date, June 7th, 1983. She brought it back to Gerald's darkroom and developed it using the chemical solution that was still somehow fresh. The process worked in reverse as before. The image appeared, faded to blank, then reappeared differently. Margaret stood on the porch, younger than the woman in the photograph Miranda had found, and she was gesturing, beckoning, calling someone forward. Miranda touched the wet photograph. The world inverted. She felt herself pulled forward, compressed, stretched, and then she was standing on the porch of Gerald's farmhouse. But not the farmhouse as it existed now. This was the farmhouse from 1983, paint bright, yard maintained, and Margaret Wickham stood 3 feet away, solid and real. Margaret spoke urgently. She'd been trapped in the photograph for 36 years. Time moved differently here, slower, compressed. She'd experienced decades as months, waiting for Gerald to find a way to pull her back. But Gerald hadn't understood what he'd created. The photographs didn't capture time. They created pockets, isolated timelines, that branched off from reality at the moment of exposure. Anyone trapped in a photograph existed in a loop, living the same moment repeatedly with slight variations, unable to escape because the moment had no exit, no future, only eternal present. Margaret explained that Gerald had tried to follow her, had touched multiple photographs over the years, trapping himself in different temporal loops. That's why he'd aged so rapidly toward the end, why he'd seemed confused and displaced. He was existing simultaneously in multiple photograph timelines, his consciousness fragmented across dozens of frozen moments. When his body finally died, his consciousness was released, but the pieces remained trapped in the photographs he'd entered. Miranda asked how to escape. Margaret led her through the farmhouse, and the world around them shifted with each room. Different moments, different versions of the same space. They reached the dark room, and Margaret showed her the solution. The reversal process. A photograph could only trap someone if they touched it while wet, while the image was still developing. But if someone inside a photograph could reverse the development, could erase the image, the timeline would collapse and release anyone trapped within. They found the chemicals, the specific formulation Gerald had used. Miranda helped Margaret prepare the reversal solution. They poured it over the photograph from inside, experiencing the bizarre sensation of being part of an image that was dissolving, fading to blank paper. The world around them dissolved with it, colors draining away, structures simplifying to lines, lines simplifying to nothing. Miranda woke on the floor of Gerald's darkroom back in 2019. Margaret lay beside her, unconscious but breathing. Miranda called 911. EMTs arrived and took Margaret to the hospital. She was alive, physically intact, but she'd aged 36 years in the span of however long Miranda had been inside the photograph. Minutes in real time, decades in the photograph's compressed timeline. Margaret recovered physically but never mentally. She insisted she was still trapped, that the dark room was just another layer of the photograph, that none of them had truly escaped. She died 6 months later, and Miranda was listed as finding her body. The autopsy showed no physical cause. She'd simply stopped, as if someone had switched her off. Miranda tried to destroy the photographs and chemicals, but they persisted. She burned them, but found them intact the next day. She buried them, but they appeared in her car. She threw them in a river, and they were waiting in her apartment when she returned home. The photographs couldn't be destroyed because they weren't physical objects in the traditional sense. They were temporal anchors, fixed points where reality had been folded and compressed, and they would exist as long as the moments they depicted remained part of history. Miranda lives with them now. Boxes of Gerald's photographs stored in her apartment, slowly changing, developing new images, showing new moments. Sometimes she sees herself in them, standing in locations she hasn't visited, wearing clothes she doesn't own, living lives that might be her future or might be alternate timelines branching from choices she hasn't made yet. And sometimes, late at night, she hears that clicking sound, rhythmic and persistent, the sound of a camera shutter capturing moments, freezing time into images that refuse to stay frozen, that continue forward in their isolated timelines, collecting anyone foolish enough to touch them while they develop, adding victims to an expanding gallery of temporal prisons disguised as photographs. Each image a trap, each trap a fragment of reality that exists parallel to ours, close enough to see but separated by the thin barrier of photographic paper and chemical solution, and Miranda knows eventually she'll touch one again. Will be pulled into a frozen moment. Will join Margaret and Gerald and everyone else who believed photography could capture time without understanding that time, once captured, never stops trying to escape, never stops reaching out through the images, never stops calling to the living to come closer, to look deeper, to touch the wet surface and step through into moments that have no end because they're protected from time's forward flow, preserved forever in the darkness of a developing tray where photographs develop backwards from what should be toward what never was, and what never was is always hungry for what might be. Story 10. The Thing in the Roots. Samuel Garrett worked for a timber company in eastern Kentucky, managing controlled logging operations in the mountains surrounding Hazard. He'd been in forestry management for 23 years, overseeing crews, marking trees for harvest, ensuring environmental compliance. It was outdoor work that paid decently and kept him away from underground mining, the profession that had killed his father and two uncles. In spring of 2018, Samuel's company acquired cutting rights to a section of old-growth forest that had been held privately for over a century, only recently released after the owner's death and estate settlement. The forest was unusual from the start. The trees were ancient, some over 400 years old, eastern hemlocks and white oaks of tremendous size. The company planned selective harvesting, taking only the most valuable specimens while preserving the overall ecosystem. Samuel's job was to map the area and identify harvest targets. He entered the forest with his survey crew in April, expecting a standard assessment that would take 3 or 4 days. The first indication of wrongness was the silence. Old-growth forests are typically loud with bird calls and insect sounds, but this forest was dead quiet. No birds, no squirrels, no visible wildlife of any kind. The underbrush was minimal, as if nothing grew beneath the canopy. Samuel's crew commented on the unease they felt, the sense of being watched, but Samuel dismissed it as the typical discomfort of entering an unfamiliar forest. On the second day, they found the clearing, a perfect circle approximately 60 feet in diameter, in the center of which stood a single massive oak tree larger than any other in the forest. The tree was dead, its bark stripped away, its wood bleached white, its branches empty of leaves. But the root system was visible above ground, spreading out in a network that looked less like roots and more like veins, pulsing slightly as if fluid moved through them. Samuel's crew refused to enter the clearing. An irrational refusal, Samuel thought, born from superstition. He stepped into the circle himself, approaching the dead oak to examine it. As he drew near, he noticed the roots weren't embedded in soil. They hung suspended above the ground, held in place by nothing visible, and beneath them the earth was hollow. He could see down into darkness, into a cavity that extended deep underground. The roots didn't grow into the earth, they hung down into the hollow, drawing something up, pulling it toward the surface. Samuel knelt at the edge of the hollow and shined his flashlight down. The cavity was massive, extending further than his light could reach. And the roots, those pale, suspended roots, penetrated down into the darkness, connecting the dead oak to something below. As Samuel watched, one root pulsed visibly, contracting and expanding like an esophagus swallowing. Something was moving through the root, traveling upward, drawn toward the surface. He backed away, disturbed beyond his ability to articulate. He ordered his crew to retreat, to mark this area as unsuitable for harvest. They left the forest that afternoon, filing a report that cited unstable soil conditions and potential sinkhole danger. The company accepted the assessment and revised their harvest plan to exclude the clearing and surrounding area. Samuel tried to forget what he'd seen, but curiosity gnawed at him. What was beneath that oak tree? What were the roots drawing upward? He researched the property's history and discovered unsettling information. The forest had been in the same family, the Caudle family, since the 1820s. Generation after generation had held the land but never developed or logged it. Family records available through historical societies included references to the feeding tree and the duty of maintenance. Every generation, one family member was designated as guardian, responsible for ensuring the tree remained undisturbed. The last guardian, Herbert Caudle, had died at 93 without descendants. His will included a provision attempting to protect the forest in perpetuity. But legal challenges from distant relatives had broken the trust, allowing the timber company to acquire cutting rights. Herbert's personal journals, donated to the local historical society, provided disturbing details. The oak tree was ancient, possibly over 1,000 years old, and it had been dead for as long as anyone could remember. But it remained standing, nourished by what it drew from below. Beneath the forest, according to Caudle family history, was a vast system of caverns where something had been sealed away by the Cherokee people centuries before European contact. The oak tree had been planted above the sealing site deliberately, its roots designed to act as bars, preventing what was trapped below from emerging. As long as the tree stood and the roots remained intact, the thing below stayed contained. But trees don't live forever. The oak was dying structurally, its wood degrading, its ability to anchor the roots weakening. Herbert had spent his life researching ways to reinforce or replace the tree, but he'd found no solution. His journals ended with a final entry. "The roots are failing. It will be free soon. God forgive us for what our ancestors bound and what we can no longer hold." Samuel returned to the forest alone, a month after his initial survey. He needed to see if the tree still stood. He reached the clearing at dusk and found the oak had fallen. The massive trunk lay across the clearing, shattered into sections, and the roots had torn free of whatever held them. The hollow beneath was fully exposed, a pit descending into darkness, and from that pit came sound. A breathing sound, but vast, like wind moving through enormous lungs, and with each breath the temperature dropped, frost forming on the grass despite the April warmth. Samuel approached the pit's edge and looked down. Something moved in the darkness below, something massive, unfurling after centuries of compression. He saw glimpses, flesh that looked like stone, eyes that reflected light in colors that didn't exist in nature, appendages that might have been limbs or tentacles or something with no terrestrial name. It was rising, drawn upward by the absence of the roots that had held it, moving slowly but with terrible inevitability toward the surface. Samuel ran. He drove straight to the sheriff's office and tried to explain what he'd seen. They dismissed him naturally. A cavity beneath a fallen tree, probably bats or groundwater effects creating echoes. They sent a deputy to investigate the next day. The deputy found the clearing, found the fallen oak, but reported no pit. The ground beneath the tree was solid, undisturbed soil and rock. No hollow, no cavity. The deputy filed a report suggesting Samuel might be experiencing stress or substance abuse issues. But 2 weeks later, the incidents began. Livestock in the area dying overnight from no determinable cause. Wildlife disappearing, entire populations of deer and wild turkey vanishing from the region. People reporting nightmares, all sharing similar imagery. Something enormous moving through the earth, something that had been compressed for centuries, expanding now, reclaiming space it had been denied, pushing upward through soil and stone toward the surface world that had forgotten why the Cherokee had sealed this place and why the Caudle family had maintained the binding for 200 years. Samuel moved to Lexington seeking distance, but distance doesn't matter when the thing you fled is measured in miles underground, spreading through the mountains, growing as it rises, following mineral deposits and water tables, using the natural structures beneath the Appalachians as pathways to extend its presence. He monitors seismic reports obsessively. Small earthquakes are increasing in frequency across eastern Kentucky. Ground-penetrating radar used for mining surveys shows massive anomalous voids forming where solid rock should be. Sinkholes are opening across the region, exposing caverns that shouldn't exist, filled with air that smells of stone and ancient depths. Samuel knows what's happening. The thing beneath the oak tree isn't a localized entity. It's vast, extending through the geological structures beneath the entire mountain range. The Cherokee didn't seal it in that one location. They sealed one point of emergence, one place where it touched the surface world. The oak tree held that one door closed. But the thing has countless other doors, countless other points where it presses against the boundary between the deep earth and the surface. And now that one binding has failed, the others are weakening, sympathetic collapse spreading along lines of connection humans never knew existed. One day, maybe this year or maybe decades from now, the thing will emerge fully. Not in one location, but everywhere simultaneously. Rising through the mountains like a slow geological event, reclaiming the surface world it occupied before humans arrived, before the Cherokee learned the bindings, before oak trees were planted to hold doors closed. And when it emerges, it will be slow enough that most people won't notice until too late, until the mountains themselves have changed, until the forests grow wrong and the earth breathes with rhythms that match nothing in nature, until everyone living in these mountains realizes they're not living on the surface of the earth, but on the surface of something else, something ancient and patient and finally free. And will understand too late that Appalachia wasn't named for the native people who lived here, but for the thing that lived beneath them, the thing they'd tried to seal, the thing in the roots that waits and grows and rises slowly toward the world, that thought it was safe above ground, the world that cut down the trees and broke the bindings and invited it back to the surface without ever knowing what dwells in the depths beneath the oldest mountains in the world.